My name's Herb. I'm an alcoholic. Welcome to our Big Book 12-step workshop. I invite you to confirm your willingness to have an open mind and an open heart, praying for spiritual intervention with the set-aside prayer. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, the 12 steps, and you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, the 12 steps, and especially you. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. We've been on a journey of orientation, and we're still on it. An orientation that's quite substantive. The first one quite administrative, the first workshop. But after that, we looked at why we're doing this, and awakening step 12, and how I recommend that you do it using the tools of step 11 and 10, meditation and inventory. Meditation to access more power, inventory to make sure the access is as clean as possible, removing those daily obstacles. We're going to begin looking at the Roman numerals, which again is continuation of the orientation, because the Roman numerals represent the prefaces and the forwards of the various editions of the Big Book. There have been 4 now. The most recent one is the one you're using, 2001. About every 20, 25 years, AA issues a brand new edition. The first edition in 1939, the next one in 1955, the next one, I believe it was 1975, and now 2001. And the reason they issue this new edition is not because they change anything in the textbook. The only thing that really changes in any substantive way are the stories. Some stories are deleted, some stories are added, some stories are renamed and reworked and placed in a different order. And the purpose of that, from the Roman numerals, they indicate the sole purpose of changing the stories is to upgrade it to meet the culture of the day. In the beginning, very few women. Of course, today, 50% of the 12-step recovery world is women, at the least. And so we have young people and older people and people of color and people from different continents, and we have their stories now. The purpose is so that people will be able to identify. The problem is the same: alcohol. The circumstances are quite different. The vocabulary and experience is quite different over the decades. And so the people who want to help serving in the General Service Office want to make stories available so people can identify. That's the sole purpose of it. The only substantive change in the pages 1 to 164, the only substantive change is the word that we looked at in our very first assignment, spiritual experience, spiritual awakening. Step 12, as I mentioned, read spiritual experience in the first edition, first printing. In the second printing, a couple years later, 1941, it read spiritual awakening, and Bill put Appendix 2 in the back of the book to explain that. What is a spiritual experience and a spiritual awakening? How are they the same? How are they different? And we saw that they're identical in terms of outcome. It's a change in the way we think and feel and behave. That's what it means. It doesn't mean anything mystical in the sense of white light and mountaintop and wind blowing through you like Bill had. It doesn't mean that. That's a spiritual experience, but those are the drama features of it, the time frame of it. The product is that Bill was changed. Now, he was changed immediately. He calls that a spiritual experience because it was at the same time he had this white light experience, this mountaintop mystical wind blowing through him, a room filled with the presence of God. It lasted 20 minutes. It was awesome, and it changed his life and ours forever. But most people don't have that, don't expect that. Here we are, we're expecting and promised a spiritual awakening in step 12. And that means that a change in the way we think and feel and behave, but it will take a while. Sometimes weeks, months, even years. Each person's journey will be quite different. Don't measure your journey. Don't measure your journey by anybody else's journey. Although you can talk about what the change is in their life so that you can perhaps identify with that and aspire to that yourself, some form of change that will reduce your suffering and bring you to happiness and joy. That's the promise. Happy, joyous, and free. It's in the big book. That's one of the promises. Happy, joyous, and free. Free of the addiction, first half of the first step, and free of unmanageability, the second half of the first step. And the reason the book hasn't been changed from pages 1 to 164, and there would be some legitimate changes that would make it a better book in today's culture, to neutralize the male gender would be just a wonderful change in the big book. But here's how it works. If we change something for a very good reason, next year we'll change something for not so good a reason, and that's a slippery slope. So AA has taken a principled attitude toward any change in the big book. The answer is no. Let's stay with the original text and interpret it in terms of its meaning. Not only the literal words from Bill's pen in 1939 out of the culture that he experienced, but what was the spirit of it? And that's where we have an expanded interpretation of it, which you will meet regularly as we go through the steps, because I've been through the steps 4 different times with 4 different teachers, 4 different step big book mechanics. I call them step guides. Then none of them were ever my sponsor. They were project managers, as I've mentioned before. And it was a progressive change and awakening. So let's take a look at the title page in the big book. And it literally is the second page behind it's the first page behind the cover, the second page in the book, the cover being the first page, and it only has 2 words on it. And I asked you to look up the word anonymous. It comes from the Greek onoma, O-N-O-M-A, which means name. And when you put an A-N in front of it, which is a negative in the Greek language, it means no name. Boy, that sure takes any mystery out of the word anonymous. It just means that there is no individuality. This is a spiritual principle that's codified in the 2 traditions, tradition 11 and tradition 12. Later on in the development of Alcoholics Anonymous, they were ratified at the General Service Conference, the very first one in 1950. But it just means that there's no one person that's going to be above or below or outstanding or unique. That's the goal here, the value proposition. It's really connected to humility, a spiritual principle. Humility is a word that comes from the Latin humus, H-U-M-U-S, which means earth or dirt. Not as a dismissive denigration, but as a indication that it's common as dirt. Or in my area, we have beaches. I live in Southern California, and I look out on the sand and the beach, and there are grains of sand, of course, billions of grains of sand, and each one of them probably different in their shape. But when you look at the beach, you don't see individual grains of sand, you just see the sand. That's the concept, the metaphor for the fellowship, a spiritual principle that we're all the same and anonymous, and nobody is to rise above in terms of visibility of specialness. Now, there is a difference in the spirit in AA. I'll talk about AA, and it might be different in a different fellowship. I don't have experience with that. In Akron, where Bob Smith was, he had a very strong opinion that you needed to use not only your first name, but your last name in meetings. A strong opinion. I won't get into the discussion because it's not important. I just want to point it out. And because he felt that people needed to know how to reach you, and without a last name, they couldn't do that. In contrast, Bill in New York felt that that was close to a tradition break, using the last name because it made you special. It was what distinguished you. And so Bill in the New York group, and now the New York culture, is that they use their first name and maybe their last initial. In the final analysis, as I've done some review of this and had lots of discussions with credible people to resolve, so what's the approach? The book is quite clear. The traditions are quite clear. You make a decision as how anonymous you want to be and how you want to be referred to. That is completely your decision. What is the tradition, 11 and 12, is that at the public level, press, radio, television, movies, at the public level, that you never pronounce that you're a member of that specific fellowship. I regularly say at the public level that I'm a member of a 12-step fellowship. That's not a problem. But I don't say that I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And also, the spirit and the letter is that your picture not be posted in a magazine or a newspaper, anything at a public level. Obviously, now there's lots of discussion around what we're doing here in terms of the Zoom and the electronic communication. I don't believe they've given any real substantive guidance yet on that. I'm not current, and so I'm not sure exactly what the recommended approach is from General Service Office of AA. On that second title page, it's got some more information. It says how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism. Now that's a change from the original first edition, which said how the story of how 100 men have recovered. There were no women with 6 months of sobriety in April of 1939. Now in the second printing, they changed it. It said how 100 men and women have recovered, because there was a woman, her name was Marty Mann, and she was a client, a patient of Dr. Tebow's. Turned out to be quite a brilliant woman and made a major contribution here in the United States. She founded the National Council on Alcoholism, which is still vital today in every city in the United States. Now, that's one of the changes they made, going from how 100 men and women to now how many thousands. But that's not a substantive change. That's a reflection of the numbers. And that's the kind of changes that you'll see throughout the book, where they bring the numbers into accuracy with the current population. But I also want to make out another very important observation. He uses the word recovered. I do not want to create controversy, but this is my take on what does it mean, because he uses that term throughout the book. Recovered, past tense. He doesn't use the word in recovery. He doesn't use the word recovering. He uses the past tense recovered when he's referring to somebody who has done all of the steps, because it reflects what he says in step 10, and we've seen that. We're placed in a position of neutrality, pages 85 and 86. We are placed. Hear the grace of that. It's not because it's human development and we do it. It's a gift. It's a grace. We can't earn it. We are placed in a position of neutrality, and we're given, that means we're given freedom from our addiction, freedom from our addiction, freedom from the problem of the body, freedom from the problem of the mind, and a gift of abstinence. It's guaranteed. That's the promise of this. In the 10th step, it says we've entered the world of the spirit. After we complete step 9, it's in step 10. We enter the world of the spirit. We come out of the world of self. That's the turning that we begin in step 3. Made a decision to turn. The turning from self-centeredness to other-centeredness, a process that's precipitated by steps 4 through 9. But ominously in step 10, as I've made it very clear, I hope, it says we're not cured. Okay, now we have 2 words, recovered but not cured. What's the difference, Herb? Recovered means that we're placed in a position of neutrality with regard to our addiction, first half of the first step. Then there's a dash and it says unmanageability. We're not cured of our unmanageability. Some of you who haven't done this work with me might not know exactly what unmanageability means. You will in about 3 months, because we spend a month on the body, we spend a month on the mind, and we spend a month on the will. We spend a month looking at the first half of the first step, allergy and craving. And then another month on the second half of the first step, addiction. Looking at the mind, obsession and delusion. That's all about addiction. Powerless, no choice. When I put it in me, no choice. I will put more in me. When I don't put it in me, no choice. I will put it in me sometime. Maybe not right away, but a day later, a week later, a month later, a year later, a decade later. And you see it in the rooms. People with 10 and 20 and 30 years relapse. Bill promised in step 10, you're not cured. You have a daily reprieve if you practice 10, 11, and 12 on a daily basis, keeping the channel clear in 10, filling the channel with meditation in step 11, and allowing that channel to seep out to the world around you in helping others in step 12. So my interpretation, it's just mine. You won't find this in the big book. You might not even find it in the AA literature. Is that recovered refers to the first half of the first step, not cured refers to the second half of the first step. All right, so then you can take a look at the table of contents, and I'm not going to analyze it here, but there's one of the uses of the Way of Life document. I think it's page 3 or someplace in there, that the Way of Life document shows the table of contents. I analyze it to see what it reveals to us about the discussion of the problem, those first 3 chapters, and a discussion of the solution, the balance of the book. On the left-hand side, I indicate that on that diagram, and on the right-hand side, I give a specific indication as where those instructions on each of the steps are found. And when I do some type of an analysis of it, which I'm inclined to do, you'll find that I'm fairly analytical in my approach. It shows me that over 30% of the big book's instructions are on step 1. That's very indicative of its importance. But then you'll also notice that over 40% of the big book is on step 12. 75% by my calculation of the big book instructions are on steps 1 and 12. The foundation, and Bill says the foundation stone. The foundation, step 1, the foundation stone, step 12. 75%. Now we're going to spend the majority of our time on steps 2 through 11 together here in terms of looking at and applying those instructions, especially steps 2 through 9. You've had a glimpse of 10, 11, and 12. By the end of the time together, we'll do a little bit deeper dive, but I'm more concerned with a very deep dive for you in steps 1 through 9, and that's my goal. To have you enter into step 9 with the tools of being able to do it, the direction, to understand what you need to do, what is suggested to do from my experience and other people's experience, in terms of bringing yourself through the final phase to the freedom that it promises, freedom from the addiction and freedom from the unmanageability. And so let's take a look at the preface. That's Roman numeral 11. There's a lot of material there, which you're welcome to have highlighted. The only thing that I highlighted that I want to make a comment on, that it says in that second paragraph, it's a textbook. It's a basic text. Now, the context doesn't reflect the prominence that I'm about to give it, but I see this book as a textbook, literally like school textbook. It needs to be read and reread, and it needs to be taught in order to really actually break it open so that you can understand it in the light of somebody else's experience. You need to write about it, you need to talk about it, and then maybe you need to even reread it. This is a textbook, and this will be the approach that we will use. It is a textbook. I'm going to skip then to the next page, or turn to the next page. And at the very end of that page, it gives us a formula for perhaps when you're sharing your experience. And that would be, tell them what happened to you. Tell them how you felt. Show them how this program has worked for you. Because that's the point of the identification of the stories. What was it like in terms of your addiction and the experiences that you had? Some people get lost in their story because it's so much drama. The story is interesting, but it's just a variation on everybody's story. We create our own suffering through our addiction. But what happened to me when I came into the rooms and started taking action and taking direction, that's really important. That in fact, I don't suffer like that anymore. I've been given freedom. And that builds hope. I believe this can work for me, to newcomer or to yourself, if in fact you're struggling in any area. If you're struggling with your addiction, it's particularly relevant. If you're not struggling with your addiction because you've been given relief and you're living in neutrality, but you're struggling with life, this is going to be even more relevant. My target group are people with at least 5, maybe 10, 15, 20 years of sobriety who are in serial suffering. Serial, daily. They're being crushed by life. And they're sober, have sponsors, and they go to meetings. Something's amiss. Something's amiss. I don't know what it is specifically, but generally, the big book suggests you're not spiritually fit. It's not a judgment. It's their conclusion. What does fit mean? It means that you're in alignment with God. You're in alignment with reality. You're in alignment with principles of human behavior. I may be speaking Greek to some of you. What does all of that mean, Herb? Yep, that's what we're going to unpack. In the forward to the edition, in fact, Bill confirms we are 100 men and women who have recovered, there it is again, from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. Bill focuses on the first half of the first addiction. Now, he would use the term alcohol because this book was written by him, an alcoholic, for alcoholics. But of course, over time, other people have found it useful. In fact, in the preface to that first edition, here you can see in the last sentence of that first paragraph, he says, and because we are sure that our way of living has its advantages for all. He's referring here not only just to alcoholics, but also to addicts of any kind, but he's also broadening it. All human beings. The first half of the first step is relevant to any addiction, process or substance. A substance addiction is food, alcohol, drugs, substance addiction. A process addiction is everything else. Gambling, pornography, work, exercise, religion, anger, fear, control, manipulation. These are areas for addiction, and there are 110 plus 12-step fellowships in Southern California to deal with specific addictions that have been identified. I think there's 8 different 12-step fellowships for food addicts. There's at least 5 to 10 different fellowships for drug addicts. Heroin Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, Marijuana Anonymous, Methamphetamine Anonymous, because they have felt that their particular drug has created a unique relationship with addiction. And now they're approaching the steps with that focus, but then with the broad hope of a spiritual awakening that will give them that relief. A hopeless state of mind and body. Bill focuses on the first half of the first step as part of his whole discussion on the first step, as we'll talk about later when we begin looking at the first step. We have to look for unmanageability in chapters 4 and 5 in order to really see what he means by unmanageability. Then he goes on in that paragraph to show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. Notice precisely how we have recovered is in italics. Joe and Charlie would, with a wonderful sense of humor, call them those are the squiggly lines. Italic, the big book's way of highlighting. Precisely. Remember textbook? Precisely. How we have recovered, meaning been placed in a position of neutrality with regard to our addiction. On the following page, page 14, he says, the only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. This was written in 1939 when they didn't have very much experience. In 1950, when they crafted the traditions, they crafted Tradition 3, and it read, the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. They dropped the term honest. Bill's comment was, no new alcoholic can be honest about anything. So all they need is a desire to stop drinking. That might have some relevance for you who are in other fellowships, who might have sort of a more rigid view of the approach to the steps. There's a sentence here at the end of the page. We should like to be helpful in such cases. About 20 years ago, in my meditation, the Spirit said to me, Herb, drop the word service in your 12-step work. Don't talk about service. It's too sophisticated. Use the word help, because it's got earth and dirt in it. You will get tired. You will be frustrated. You will be bored when you're helping other people. It will take your time away from your life. Use the word help because it has earth in it. It brings you into a humility of helping one another as just another suffering person. So wonderful for me lens through which to look. I don't look through in my 12th step work, and I don't talk about service. I talk about how can I help? And then it broadens. My initial effort was helping alcoholics, and then, as you've heard me share, it widens so that now I try to make my work available to anybody who wants a spiritual awakening. How can I be helpful? All right. And so next week, I'm asking you to finish assignment 2, which is certainly to have read and highlighted the balance of the forwards. This second forward here is the most fruitful from my standpoint, because it's got wonderful information and history, which I'll unpack some of it next week. At the same time, I asked you, when you're reading this, to be asking yourself those 4 questions without answering them, and that at the end of your reading of the forward to the 4th edition, at the end of the reading and highlighting, that you answer those 4 questions. And so I would like you to bring that reading to conclusion by next week and answer the questions if you want to or can. I'm asking you to finish now assignment 2, which would be to finish the reading, and then by the following week's workshop to have finished writing out your reflections on those 4 questions.
Can you just go over a little bit about the process addiction and like for Al-Anon, like for codependency? Like...
Well, but that's your challenge. The answer is yes. Happy to have this dialogue because, and in fact, for me, it's close to the most important dialogue I have in the first half of the first step is with the Al-Anons to help them understand and experience what a process addiction is.
Yeah.
Because alcohol, drugs, and food, pretty straightforward because it's a substance. But what is the issue with Al-Anon? And quite frankly, that's my question to you to identify when we go through the material on the body and the mind, especially on the body, is how do you identify a parallel vocabulary with that? I answered your question because it's really relevant and it kind of perks everybody's interest. But that's the kind of thing that we're going to get a deep dive into so that you can have an experience with it that would parallel my experience with alcohol or somebody else's experience with food or somebody else's experience with gambling. Yeah,
that's good.
Because the heart of the question is, what is the parallel vocabulary? So I really reach out to the Al-Anons, especially. I've got some vocabulary from my experience. My daughter, who is in Al-Anon 30 years, she said, "Dad, your problem is drinking. My problem is thinking." She has compulsive thoughts once she allows it, once she engages in the second thought.
First, you just blew me away with the whole Al-Anon being an addict to the process, which is fascinating. I've been in recovery 16 years, but the man I'm with now has just started drinking again. So I am like in full Al-Anon, counting bottles, the whole thing. So new light, and I appreciate it. My question was more towards anonymity and how I feel it's changed over the past few years with Facebook and people, and I've done it myself, you know, posting the number of years you have, or people now just kind of putting their Zoom meetings up on Facebook to let people know. And I'm wondering, you think that has to do with being removed from humility in a way?
I don't want to judge it. As I mentioned in my comments, the whole area of social media is a concern, but I don't believe it's been finally addressed by the General Service Office in any comprehensive way. They've probably given some opinions about it, but not in a comprehensive way. So I don't know what the current stance is, but it is a concern. I'm very clear from my study of the traditions prior to social media as to what the situation is. When I began publishing books, I actually had a phone conversation with the General Service Office executive director and some other board members, trustees, and because I was going to go without a name on my books, and they said, no, you put your name and your first name and your last initial on your books. Don't put your picture on it. And so that's what I followed their direction on that.
Do you think if I'm putting on Facebook 16 and then continuing to check what the comments are, I am completely then in my ego? Like, it's got to be
Well,
that.
you may be. My recommendation, without being silly, is maybe you want to see what your motive is for all of that.
Isn't that interesting? I just found that really
well, it is actually interesting
Yeah.
to you. It has no interest to me, but it is interesting to you.
Yeah. Well, it's just so many people are doing it. That's, you know.
Well, but see, you're not responsible for anybody but yourself. So check your motive. What's your motive in that? Is it really to be helpful? Or is it to be popular?
Right.
Is it burning incense at your ego? Or is it a reach out so that you're available to help people?
Right. Great.
It's
Great
all
question.
in your intention, really. Yeah. The
Thanks.
same behavior can be either a healthy behavior or an unhealthy behavior.
Right.
Depending on intention. And then, of course, outcome. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you would be willing to just share. I've read it, but I kind of would love to just hear from you. I have two questions. One, would you be willing to share kind of your morning and evening practices and what they look like, just practical, like just the on the ground kind of what those practices look like? And my second question is about neutrality. I'd be interested if, in your experience in long-term, what I assume you would describe long-term contented sobriety that you've been dedicated to, what is the quality of that neutrality? What does it look like and feel like to you? And what challenges that neutrality for you in long-term, one day at a time, but long-term sobriety?
Let's take the first one first. Based on a review of pages 85, 88, highlighting it and then outlining it. And over time, as I had a practice, I outlined it as I was preparing for my workshops so that people would have a script for themselves. So you could look at pages 45 to 50 in the Way of Life document, pages 45 to 50, and you would see the practice structure that I established for myself back in 1988, 89, where I literally wrote out the questions for the nightly review, and I read them in a meditation to myself in the night. It might take 3 or 4 minutes, but it like a radar sweep. It wasn't a major meditation, and it still isn't for me. I probably sit 2 to 3 times a day in a meditation. I'm retired and my schedule is my own. My goal is to meditate 2 or 3 times a day. I eat 3 times a day usually, and I typically build a 10 to 20-minute meditation around that. The morning practice, however, is my most favorite and my most faithful and the longest practice. And that is in the morning, I start with prayer. It's typically a 30-minute period. I start with prayer. I move into meditation, and then I move into my contemplative practice, which is centering prayer. And if I were to give it an allocation of time, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 25 minutes, that kind of thing. Any questions on that?
No, it's great to hear. I like hearing. I mean, I'm interested in knowing, yeah, in that, what feels essential to you, and what where I'm coming from too is I love that morning practice too, and part of me can clip in and out of being really like my achiever mode can even enter that realm, like, and I you know, of course I want to get it right, but now I remember somebody said in early recovery to me, you know, when someone had asked, how long do I have to keep doing this? 30 minutes every day. And they said, keep doing it until you want to do it, you know, and that was really helpful. And I mean, now I love it. It's sort of a favorite time of the day too, but I can tend sometimes to be, I mean, I'm really busy. I got lots of demands for work, and I love that time. I can feel that time wanting to expand into the day, and it can create its own unmanageability, like, and I can start to become very anal about, okay, it's 30 minutes of exact quiet, and then
That's where a timer came in handy for me when I was working, so that I knew that one of my teachers said, there's only 2 mistakes that you can make: not show up and leave early. So I showed up, I set the timer, and the timer told me when I was done. I didn't leave before the timer went off, but I did leave when the timer went off. Because like you, I mean, we're addicted, right? And when it feels good, or at least we have an ego gratification from how wonderful we are as a meditator, right? That, you know, I'm so spiritual. I wish people would have a video and see me, because they would be so impressed. I mean, all right, we don't get well real quickly, right? Exactly.
Right. And so I really was interested in, like, what's essential to you, because you're obviously an orthodoxy kind of guy with, in a big way, with the 12 steps, which I'm loving. And yet you're free. I mean, it's both. It's sort of like God keeps expanding, but you've got the structure. So what in that morning time of the practice just for you is essential? And you've shared it a little bit already. So, but I mean, I didn't know if there's anything else more to say about essential qualities of your practice.
First, my meditation practice is about my relationship with the Spirit. And I keep that in mind. It's about relationship. And one of the wisest things in the big book is in Appendix 2, where he says, awareness of the presence of God is the essence of a spiritual experience. It's that awareness. So I try to foster it in the morning in such a way that it will cycle through me as a recurring awareness throughout my waking day. That's what's important to me, to be aware of this presence as I'm living my life in the present moment, so that I'm motivated to trust, certainly, and to try to be loving and kind. It doesn't come naturally to me a lot of times, you know, and so it's kind of like, I'm a heavy does it guy, and, you know, and yeah, and people in the past were just collateral damage for me getting my way, and I wasn't overly concerned about it. Now I'm very concerned about it, and I try to be very sensitive to it. So.
And then I was curious about the neutrality piece too.
Yeah. Now, see, I was given the gift before I asked for anything, before I was aware of anything. On February 20th, 1984, they asked me to stop drinking. on February 21st, I had my first day without a drink, and I have never had any inclination or problem with it since. I didn't go to AA for 2 more months. So I've been in neutrality from the very beginning, and not because I did anything, but because I received a gift that I hadn't asked for.
Mm-hmm. So Herb, like for you, is as a substance addict, as you've described, I mean, obviously there's a mental component to that as well. So, I mean, for me, like I'm a food addict and the food is down, and
Very
yet
different.
I
Yeah.
still have they're active. I don't know, I'm not craving the foods, but there's still that grasping quality to other aspects of my life which continue. Is that, I mean, and yeah.
I don't have that. The unmanageability, the ego-centeredness, the restless, irritable, and discontent that Chris was referring to, that has cycled in and out of my life depending on my spiritual fitness. But at this point, it's been at least 20, 25 years since it's been even a speed bump, let alone any type of major drama.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you really credit that to your spiritual foundation and fitness, of course. Yeah. And the daily work that you're doing to
I do.
possible.
Yeah, I do. Yep.
Thank you.
My question is about the idea of anonymity, and you've really helped clarify that the anonymity is about having equality and egalitarianism and lack of hierarchy, and that makes a lot of sense, and not just like not kind of outing each other to the public, and I really appreciate that. That said, I saw a film a couple years ago called The Anonymous People.
I do recommend the film. I really like the film. I've seen it a couple times.
Do you see a contradiction?
do you have a question though?
Yeah, do you see any contradiction there between like the principles of AA and the anonymous folks encouraging people to like use their last names in public domains?
I absolutely encourage you to be as anonymous or lack of anonymous as you want to be, with one exception. At the public level, you cannot say that you're a member of a specific 12-step fellowship and adhere to the letter of the traditions. But you can be as public as you want to be, other than describing yourself as a member of a specific 12-step fellowship.
Thank you
so much.
I think addiction, like I always felt like I never had a choice, and this gives me a choice.
Addiction, you don't have a choice.
No.
And in unmanageability, you don't have a choice. In step 2, what we see is there's where the choice is, God or no God. And that's the only choice we have.
Yeah. I'll still just take a big pause on that one. I wondered if you could share a little bit more. You talk about these questions, like ask these questions before we go into reading. Is it just the practice of asking the questions? Because I still read them every day. Like I have no idea that I read them yesterday. I'm like, oh, in what area of my life am I being dishonest with myself and others? And then I start reading.
And that's really the intent, all right? The intent, as I experienced it the way you're doing, it was that I'm sort of, in retrospect, I can see what I did. When I was doing it, I didn't see what the benefit was, because it was more robotic, kind of like that. Although I hope you put a little bit of consciousness and intention into the questions as you're asking it. But even as you're repeating the question internally, you're planting a seed, is the way I look at it. When I look back over my shoulder, somehow my unconscious was processing it as I was recognizing the question, because when I came at the end and I sat down to write it, I had no problem with the flow in answering the question. Somehow I had primed the pump by asking those questions on a daily basis.
Okay. They're very rich questions. So.
And this process is a very rich process. And one of the men that took me through the steps, in fact, the third time, he had a whole technique in approaching the big book. He said, there's a lot of questions in the big book, but there's also a lot of statements. Turn the statements into a question. And I'll tell you what, you talk about that little light being seeping through. It was like those things that you break open and things pop out of. That's the way the sentences began, the meaning began popping out of the sentences in a way that I'd never experienced before when I turned the statement into a question. At the same time, Joe and Charlie have a great thought with regard to the questions in the big book. He said, treat the question mark as a stop sign. Stop and ask yourself that question. Even stop and ask it out loud. The big book is filled with questions. And as we go through it, I'll be emphasizing that. These are not rhetorical questions. These are an invitation so that you can really participate consciously in the material that follows that question. Bill is a literary genius in the way he wrote. He sets up step one, asking a couple questions, especially in unmanageability. He starts out step two, asking a couple of questions. And so right at the beginning of separate pieces, he asks a question, sort of open, then he unpacks it with his commentary and his experience. Yeah.
Thank you.
I find it very useful to line out at the thinking part, it says, think about your day, what you're actually going to do. And I stop and I make a list, where before with all the other things, I've never been able to prioritize my day. So it's very helpful.
Well, see, you're asking for guidance. The key word from step 11 from Bill Wilson is the word guidance. If you don't get any other word on step 11, that's the key word. That's why Bill did meditation. That's why the Oxford group did meditation. That's why he included it in step 11, as step 11, to get guidance, because he knows that we don't know what to do. And if we ask the Spirit, we will be given the information if, in fact, the channel's clear. That's why inventory always precedes meditation, so that we can clear the channel, so that the light can fill the channel and give us the guidance that we want.
Yeah, it's like I finally gave up control.
Well, no, what you gave up was the delusion of control, because you never had it anyway.
Right. Sure. And the other thing I had a clarification on was the public, not public.
Public is defined in the tradition. Press, radio, television, movies. That's the public level. All right?
Perfect.
Yeah. I can go to the PTA. I can go to the Chamber of Commerce. I can go to the Congressional Committee meeting and talk to them about my addiction, all right, and my membership in AA, as long as it doesn't get reported in the press or a magazine or on television or the radio, or now I would be concerned about social media.
Thank you. That's
So
perfect.
that's what public means there. Now, that's the literal, but what's the spirit of it? The spirit of it is like, I'm not the teacher, I'm not the president of AA. All right? I'm not a guru, I'm not anything special. And this is relevant for me because I write books and I have a lot of visibility. I have to kind of try to sort it all out. So it's been a very important issue for me. Yeah.
Exactly. Intention.
Well, that's really important. Yeah. But then also the behavior and the actions are really important, because my intentions could be delusional. What's my behavior? That'll tell me the truth.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm finding that discussion of the ego to be something that is really impacting my recovery at this time. And it also falls
in what way?
In the way where my amnesia about my addiction comes in. It's like that my ego is like taking over, and I find myself in the work that I've done with the documents that we're reviewing is that I will tell myself, you know, I can do it this time. If I just want to have a little bit of this, that's totally fine. It's totally fine because I can totally manage this. This is just a little bit. But over and over and over again, the reality is, no, that leads to a major binge for me. Maybe not that same day, but then the next day I may be on track with what I'm supposed to eat, but then there's always that additional bite, or I'm just not going to weigh this. This is fine. I'm understanding my addiction a little bit better, and it's not, I'm not feeling the shame on it. I'm just feeling like, okay, this is how it works. So what can you do? Yeah.
That was the major issue. We'll talk a little bit about it next week with Bill's meeting with Dr. Bob. Bill was only in the OSH group 6 months when he met with Dr. Bob, and Bill discovered that Dr. Bob had been in the Oxford group for 2.5 years. Dr. Bob went to the meetings every week, and he shared and he prayed and he meditated, and he went home and got drunk every week for 2.5 years as a member of the Oxford group, because he thought it was a moral issue or a willpower issue or a knowledge issue, like you were just talking about. Bill comes and shows up, and he explains to him what you all are going to see if you haven't seen it before in terms of how the first step is structured. It's structured for us as human beings. Addiction, the first half of the first step, has 2 components. One is the body, one is the mind. And what you're talking about is the dynamic of that body-mind relationship. The problem with our mind is that we're vulnerable to an obsession, a thought. And as soon as we agree with the thought, it'll be different this time, and we indulge, that sets a biochemical trigger in our body. So it's a biological reaction. And you were right to conclude there's no shame here. There's no guilt here. There's an observation that I'm powerless. I'm powerless over the thought, and I'm powerless once I take the bite. I'm powerless over the second bite. So you capture the essence of it. The body and the emotions have tension. Yeah. We do. We get hungry, we get thirsty, we get horny, whatever else, you know. It's just like, this is the body at work. It's just the way it does work. And our emotions are fight, flight, and freeze. It's just the way it works for survival purposes. All right. And it's the tension that rises from all of that we've discovered we can ease that tension. It's exactly what you said. I think you said soothe. Wonderful word. We get to soothe our tension with a little food, or with a little booze, or with a little drug, or with a little gamble, or with a little control. We get to soothe our tension. The problem is we're hardwired as addicts, and I do mean biologically and in a neural sense in our brain. We are hardwired to create an addiction, not just bad habit. There's lots of people in the rooms that just have unhealthy habits. Those people don't have to work as hard as the real addict does. The real addict it's impossible. You cannot do this on your own. A person with unhealthy habits can get some good therapy, have a good relationship, get some relief, and they're just fine. They don't have to do a daily reprieve. But an addict, we have a spiritual disease that needs a spiritual solution in order to protect us from that obsession, because once we have the obsession, we're hijacked. That's why it's under the flag of powerlessness. And so the addicts predispose, because it works early on in their addiction, to have short-term gain, and they sort of rationalize long-term pain. Whereas here we are now, I've guaranteed you suffering. That's what the participant agreement is all about. But you're agreeing to short-term pain because you're hoping for long-term gain, just the reverse. It's freedom. Freedom's the goal here. I said awakening before, but AKA as a synonym, freedom. Freedom from the addiction, first half of the first step, and freedom from the serial suffering of unmanageability. This is what's guaranteed by this process. Yeah.
Nice hat.
And so I can't tell you how hopeful I am. I'm just tired of falling in the same place over and over and over again. So I'm just super grateful to find out what that variable is for me. It sounds like it's part of the daily reprieve that I keep missing. And one of the questions in the beginning was, you know, what are you looking for? And for me, it's a consistent connection with the higher power that I haven't, you know, there's that part in the big book that talks about we vaguely sense that we're doing something that's not great, you know, and to me that's heading the dimmer switch into the dark. And
yeah, but read the next story. But read the next story. That's Jim's story. We'll look at it in the mind, but as long as you brought it up, go just a couple pages more. I think it's page 3940, and read Fred's story. And he's got a line in there that will just absolutely knock you out. He says, strange mental blank spot.
Yeah.
That's what you were talking about.
Yep, exactly.
I watch it, I make up my mind that I'm not going to repeat it, and then I repeat it, and I do it more than once.
Yep.
I'm so tired.
Yep.
Yep.
I'm tired.
The single response I get from people who are finally get some traction in the program is, I got so tired of suffering. I had to just give up. I was willing then to take direction.
Yeah. I'm willing today in this moment.
Yeah, I hear it. I hear it. That's right. And step 10 captures what you said about the hope and confirms that about the vigilance, the daily reprieve. He says, watch for resentment and fear and selfishness and dishonesty. Watch for them. And he says, when they crop up, not if they crop up. So it is not that we're going to have to be intention. No, that's not it at all. I haven't thought about a drink since I was given the gift of recovery, and I haven't thought about violating human principles since I had the awakening at 10 years of sobriety about unmanageability. So it's like, I don't work that hard. It doesn't appear to be that hard, but I also have a practice that's established some habits of doing spot check inventory, step 10, doing meditation at least once a day, sometimes 2 and 3 times a day. And always asking myself, what's the operating principle? I never make a decision or a suggestion to anybody without us having a discussion about what's the principle. And then I always say, and take the high road. My sponsees get so tired of it. Herb, do we always have to take the high road? No, you don't have to take the high road, but there will be consequences. What consequences do you want? You can do anything that you want. I mean, you could commit murder. It doesn't, there's no, quote, rules here. In society there are, but not existentially. But there will be consequences. You can do anything you want as long as you're willing to deal with the consequences. Now, I didn't know the connection, and I didn't realize that I didn't know the connection. And you've heard the definition in the meetings, I'm sure, of insanity. Doing the same thing over again, expecting different results. Well, my friend, Dr. Berger, who I do emotional sobriety workshops with, he actually he heightened the tension of it. He said, We do it over and over again, expecting better results. But they're never better, but we don't see they're never better, and we don't remember they're never better, and we keep hoping. See, there's the delusion of the obsession and the insanity of the disease. And the real catch here is that we don't actually realize the delusion that it's not going to be different. One of my teachers is Richard Rohr. He's a Catholic priest, a Franciscan,
Yeah.
R-O-H-R. And he said, there are two stimulus to the spiritual life. People who have great love and people who have excruciating suffering. He said 98% of the people come to the spiritual life because of the suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
we're in good company.
Thank you, Herb.
You said people that continue to suffer don't get their powerlessness. Why do you think that is?
That's probably a very long discussion, but I'm happy to have it because it's at the core of the issue. I ask myself on a daily basis, what gives people the grace to stop suffering? What gives people the grace to recognize their suffering and that they can stop? Do you know that most people don't? Either they don't recognize it, or if they do recognize it, they're not willing to deal with it. Most people die from their addiction. Even if they've been exposed to a 12-step program, most in at least in the North America, the recovery rate is less than 20%. And I'm being generous. The addiction rate is 1 out of 10. In the United States, we have probably 150 million adults. That means there's 15 million addicts. AA worldwide has 2 or 3 million members. Just in alcohol as an addiction, let alone anything else. So it's a good question. I don't know the answer as to, what creates the blindness and what creates the recovery in the sense of long term, other than a willingness to be in action. There's a kind of a conundrum poem that came to me at one point a long time ago, and because I struggled with this question: which comes first, willingness or grace? Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Well, the chicken had to come first because that produces the egg. No, the egg had to come first to produce the chicken. Is kind of like, yeah, I mean, I'm not being literal or scientific here. I'm trying to be, in a way, creating an image and an experience. Which comes first, willingness or grace? I was willing, therefore I got the grace, or I got the grace to be willing. I took it into meditation for several weeks, and I came out with an answer. All right, but it was a poem more than it was. I was taken, hear the grace of that. I was taken to a place of willingness. And here's the real but I was willing to be taken. I was taken to a place of willingness. There's the grace. But I was willing to be taken. I look back on my early history. I was willing to attend the hospital program to support my wife's recovery. I was willing to stop drinking to support her recovery. I was willing to look at my drinking to support her recovery. I discovered that I had a drinking problem. I was willing to take direction to go to a AA meeting. And willingness became the central catapult for me every time. Not that I was aware of it, but only looking back over my shoulder, I can see that willingness was the key. But here's the question, because I don't want to beg the question. How come I was willing and my brother-in-law wasn't? In and out of the programs for 20 years, same age as me, and died of the disease. Never admitting that he was an alcoholic. How does that work? I don't know. Yeah. So I'm not sure that's a very satisfactory answer. But I accept the term that it's mystery, and I don't have to understand it. I know what works, and that's why I do these workshops. I know what works, not only from my personal experience personally, but also from my personal experience now, literally with thousands of people over the last 25 years. Yeah.
Thanks, Herb.
I am in pain. I have deep resentments. I would even call them hatred.
Yeah.
And, you know, if I'm going to be really honest, and I'm really looking forward to releasing all of that.
I walked into AA with years of therapy and lots of understanding about psychology, and I had no clue that I was a volcano inside in terms of my rage.
Yeah.
I had no clue.
Yeah.
Even 4 years sober, I had no clue until I did this work. And then I tapped into the molten lava, and and within 3 journeys through the steps, all of the lava went cold, and I haven't had any anger, resentment since 1994. Now, do I have irritation and annoyance? Absolutely. Because I'm a human being, right? But I don't have that anger that was just awful. So yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
You know, we're doing the best we can to create that unconditional thing, but I almost see it as a mathematical thing about the more unconditional love we can create in the world through the fellowship and through our lives and our choices, the more people will be able to, like they say, some are sicker than others, will be able to get into recovery. And a lot of the statistics also about who recovers, like, depends on how much functionality and they have in their family to support them, and maybe they only have enough to support a couple of people getting to recovery. Maybe the whole family gets into recovery. Maybe only one gets into recovery, and it's a systematic problem of what the values are in our world as far as materialism versus spirituality and consumerism and stuff like that. So I just see it as my responsibility to create as much unconditional love as possible, and that at least I do my part and not judge why some people are not able to make the program.
100%. I won't even comment. I'll just 100% is one. That's exactly right. Yeah. One of the Russian philosophers, Gurdjieff, said, most human beings are asleep, dreaming that they're awake. I love it because the 12th step says it's about a spiritual awakening. Oh, that means I've been spiritually asleep. Well, as many of the people who shared have indicated, not only was I spiritually asleep, I was emotionally asleep. I was consciously asleep. I was, really, I didn't know that I didn't know. And it's not my fault. I tried, but I don't know why I wasn't able to break through. But to support, I think, your opening comments and the whole kind of theme was, I think there's a renaissance right now. There's a renaissance that's been going on for 10 or 20 years spiritually in the world, as well as in the 12-step community. There's a reconnection to the big book and the step process that I can almost track chronologically worldwide. And so I have lots of hope that there's going to be an exponential sort of build, in the best of senses, multi-level marketing, as you guys finish this work and you touch 2 other people, they'll touch 2 other people, and pretty soon we'll be living in a world of peace. I mean, theoretically. See what I mean? So the best way that you can express your gratitude, number 1, is to finish this work and have the experience, and then at least touch 1 other person and help them have the same experience down the road. Yeah.
So I'm finding that my primary addiction seems to be in check right now by the grace of God. But since starting this work, another addiction is flaring. And I spoke to my sponsor this morning. She said, well, are you practicing the principles of the program in all your affairs? So my question to you is, how can I better practice the principles in all my affairs?
Yeah, it's a great question. It deserves probably a lengthier conversation and answer that I'm willing to do right now. We could cycle back if there's time at the end, but it's like whack-a-mole, our addiction. And I've never played it. I've observed it. I know what it is. It's a board game where there's a board with lots of holes in it, and the player has a hammer. And there's a gopher that sticks its head up out of the hole. And when you hit it on the head, it pops down, but pops up in another hole. That's what you're describing here. You have containment with regard to your primary addiction. You said it was correlated with starting this work, probably has created some additional tension in your life, and the tension needs to be taken care of. So a supplemental addiction that you have probably not paid enough attention to has popped up. That's my surmise on it. The big book is very clear in step 10 on pages 85 and 86. Is it 85? 84 and 85. Pages 84 and 85, it talks about step 10, and essentially it says, our addiction, first half of the first step, is placed in neutrality when we finish the first 9 steps, but our unmanageability is a daily problem. In fact, Bill says in that same section, we're not cured. So if in fact you're not spiritually fit, then the tension that you have will be treated by your addiction rather than by the power in you. The way we stay spiritually fit, Bill says, is by practicing step 10. When we're disturbed, we talk about it and take care of it. In step 11, we set ourselves up for guidance in the morning to be, in fact, filled with power and effectiveness. And we practice principles on a 24/7 basis. The question I would ask you when you had that conversation with your sponsor, did you get specific with regard to principles? Is there something perhaps out of whack, amiss in your life with regard to principles? The principles are intransible. They are not, they're immutable. They're not negotiable. So if in fact you're at all in any type of contrary action to reality and principles, you're going to create a tension. If you're a tension in your life, if in fact you're in parallel with the reality of the life force by your own behavior, by your own willingness, by your own practice of 10, 11, and 12, then in fact the tension is relieved and it goes away. So the other part of that then would be, are you paying enough attention to the thought and maybe the action of helping other people? See, all of this is rhetorical. I'm not expecting you to respond to all of what I just said, but I am expecting you to take it in and perhaps reflect on, so what's going on in me that's got me out of sync with reality, out of sync with my understanding of God's will for me? There's a source of the tension in you that you may be aware of or you may not be aware of, but that's the right question. Not what is the tension. That's an interesting question, but it's very superficial. What's the source of the tension?
Thank you, Herb.
Yeah, you're welcome. Great question, by the way. That's a fabulous question. Thank you.
What keeps you coming back?
I found what I was looking for. That's what keeps me coming back. And I know that most people's suffering comes from not knowing what the solution is, or maybe even not knowing what the problem is. The problem initially is the addiction, first half of the first step. Mm-hmm. But it's not the problem. It's not the problem. Mm-hmm. The problem is unmanageability. Bill says it's the spiritual malady. I call it the human condition. Mm-hmm. since 100% of the human race has that problem, 100% of the human race is human, they have unmanageability and they suffer from not knowing how to deal with it.
Mhm.
I have a solution because I've been given this gift of a transformation through the step process. And every one of the people that I've encountered that is willing to finish the work, steps 1 through 9, and live rigorously, not perfectly, but rigorously, leaning gently against it, is able to have a life that flourishes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Wow, wonderful question.
You know, I've met people who do this every year. I mean, I wish I had, you know, done this every year for the last 5 years. The story would have been, you know, I would have been reading about.
But that's a rabbit hole that has no benefit.
Okay.
That kind of thinking, if only or I wish, that has no relevancy because it's just not true. Here you are 4 years later, you're cyclically in and out of relapse and the program. That's just your story. Yeah. So don't look over your shoulder except to learn from it, but address what's your question right now.
Okay. Well, my question is a phrase that I hear a lot, but it's this phrase of God will do 99%. You only have to do 1%. Have you heard it?
It's cute.
Is it? I don't think so.
It's cute. It's just I would never say that. I think it's based on ignorance. It's based on it's based on somebody wants to stress the spiritual part, and that my sense is I have to work like a SOB.
Yeah.
All right. And now here's where it does come to a disproportionate result. And I talk about spiritual math. 1 and 1 in the world of the spirit equals 5. And what I mean by that is I do an awful lot of work, but the results are disproportionate to my effort. They're way bigger. They're disproportionately geometrically bigger than my contribution to it. So I understood what the person said, and it's kind of a poetic thing to kind of give you a motivation to trust God. But I would never give it that kind of proportionality, because what it almost says is you don't have to work really hard because God will take care of you, and that's just not true. God doesn't take care of us.
Tell me more.
Well, I heard a person say in a meeting about a year ago, I'm 36 years sober, and I've been going to meetings a lot over my lifetime. So I normally hear most everything. But somebody said something brand new. God protects us from nothing, but supports us in everything.
Everything.
That I can go with. You see, step 3, take a look at the wording of step 3. Made a decision to turn our will and our life over to the care of God, not to God. God doesn't want my life. God gave me my life for me to take care of. We have free will, and we can be out of alignment with reality. Reality meaning the life force, the life flow, God's will as I understand it. All right? And my role is with free will to be in alignment. I have the ability to put myself in alignment with my understanding of the will of God. Kind of like the GPS. I own the car. I drive the car. I have a driver's license and I have the insurance. I know where I want to go, but I don't know how to get there. I put the address in. I start the car, I drive the car because I know how to do that. And I listen to the GPS to give me direction. And when I follow direction, I get where I wanted to go. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I mean by turning our will and our life over to the care of God. That's what I mean by God supports us in everything and protects us from nothing.
Yeah. Got it.
But if anybody on the call has a problem with the whole God word or concept, take a deep breath. Chapter 4 is about being an agnostic. That's the title, isn't it? We agnostics. We'll cover that, and we'll assist you in coming to grips with a legitimate steps 2 and 3, no matter what you think or believe right now. Yeah, thank you. That was a wonderful question.
Right here.
Look at page 59.
Yeah. Continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it.
Now, that's the blatant statement of step 10. What is your interpretation of how to do that?
Is when when my character defects come into play: self-seeking, self-centeredness, dishonesty, fear, anger. When all that stuff comes about in my daily activity, I gotta say I'm sorry, and that's what I really have a hard time saying.
Wait, I'm sorry. Where did that come from? That's not certainly from the big book. I mean, tell me about your "I'm sorry" comment.
The amends, I guess. The amends.
Well, that's the third item. That's not the first two items. Bill says, watch for resentment and fear and dishonesty and selfishness. Then he says, when they crop up, he has 4 recommendations.
Okay.
The first recommendation is prayer. My interpretation is because we're powerless.
Right.
You said character defects. I agree with that. I'm powerless over my character defect. That's why step 7 is a prayer. So the first recommendation when I'm disturbed from those 4 that you talked about, that Bill talks about in the big book, the first recommendation is to pray. The second is to talk to somebody about it. In the same way, after inventory, step 4, you did step 5. You talked to somebody about it. This is the 12 and 12 calls it a spot check inventory. On the spot when I'm disturbed. At that moment is when I pray, I talk to somebody, I turn my thoughts to helping somebody else. I make an amend. That's the third item that you talked about. And the final 4th item recommendation is turning my thoughts to helping somebody else. Because you're disturbed because you're self-centered. Obviously, the antidote for self-centeredness is other-centeredness. Does that sound familiar?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. I didn't realize I had other addictions. I thought it was just because I'm a compulsive, chronic compulsive overeater. And I realized that, as that addiction is being, is not in the forefront, the mental twist asks and begs, or not even, just takes whatever.
It's classic.
Yeah.
Absolutely classic. A lot of times there's long timers, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40 years that come to me for help because their life is a mess and they haven't had a drink in all that time, but they have become compulsive eaters or compulsive workers or compulsive pornography or compulsive sexual misbehavior. All right? It's because they're not treating the spiritual malady, which is their humanity, unmanageability. They think that stopping drinking is enough, and it isn't, because it's not the problem. Bill's very clear. Yeah. Addiction is not the problem, but it will become the problem, and it will spread in different areas if you don't treat the problem, which is the spiritual malady. Yeah.
Okay.
I really liked today, which was God. This explains so much of my life right here, that God protects us in nothing and supports us in everything.
That's wonderful.
It was very emotional for me, and it has been very emotional. It's just a transformation I feel that's happening, and it's not getting over, but getting present with my son's death. I think I talked to you one of the first. So that's been 8 months. We talked about that. And it's just a lot of things are coming around. I'm very thankful that I have you and this program right now. This is helping me greatly.
And your practice of meditation and the other person who's in your life as a teacher, that's wonderful. And you have a sponsor, I'm assuming?
I have a couple of sponsors, yeah, in both
It's
programs.
really important that you have those
Yeah.
key people and that you stay kind of close, not dependent on them, but still very, pressed up against it. And I'm not sure exactly what I might have shared with you. My wife died 2 years ago. And I did the conscious things of the grieving and whatever else is called for in human development and psychology as well as spirituality. And I thought that after 6 months that I would be okay, and I wasn't. And after the next 6 months, I thought I'd be okay, and I wasn't. And after the next 6 months, I thought I'd be okay, and I wasn't. It's now the 4th, 6th month, and I feel like I'm okay, and I think I am. So I'm not saying that your timeline is going to be my timeline, but I am saying it took me 2 years to get my balance. Yeah,
Thank you.
You're welcome. And the being gentle, but also being connected with the people that love you. Yeah, thank you so much.
I'd like to have a serious, not serious, but a regular practice
What
in the
would that
morning.
look like if you had it?
I would sit for a little while and I would read one of the books.
And what prevents you from doing that?
I pick up my computer and I look at the New York Times.
Okay, so you don't really want to do it.
It's possible.
Well, no, we do what we want to do. It's not possible. That's the only explanation. It isn't of value to you.
You're right.
Picking up your computer to read the New York Times is a value. That's why you do it. The moment that you establish a value for sitting and reading a meditation book and being quiet and thinking about something, the moment that you establish that as a value, you'll do it. But you won't do it a moment sooner because you should. Bill says it very nicely in the 12 and 12. Well, he says it this way, because it's about the value proposition. I've had this conversation a lot of times with a lot of people, because it is the core of the motivation for doing or not doing meditation. And Bill says, as air, water, sunshine, and food nourish and sustain the body, prayer and meditation nourish and sustains the soul. And you just have to ask yourself, do you believe what I just said Bill said? There's only one measurement of willingness, and that's how do your feet move?
Oh, that's good.
Yes, it is.
That is good.
Well, it was put in let me give you the context of it because it gets better. I was doing this work in 1988, 4 years sober, with this man, this step work, for the very first time I'd ever done step work out of the book. And I was in my 9th step. And we were meeting, and he was asking me how I was doing. And I said, well, I've finished doing 6 9-step amends. And he said, that's wonderful. He said, when's the last time you made one? I said, about a month ago. He said, well, why aren't you continuing to make your amends? And I said, well, I've been real busy. My life has gotten really full thanks to this work. I'm really willing to do my amends, but I just don't seem to have the time. And he said to me, hold on. Willingness without action is fantasy. He's the same guy that said, Herb, you got a lot of information, but you have no transformation. He had a way of taking a 4x4 and bringing it down on the brow of my nose to get my attention.
My son is 90 days sober, but not in the program. I don't know why he did this. I think it's probably like to see if he can do it or something like that. I don't know, but I'm
And how old is he?
51.
51.
Yes.
So he's an adult man at this point.
Absolutely.
Did he ask you to have an opinion about his sobriety?
No. It's his journey, and that's all I can do is just hope and pray.
Well, I don't know. Are you in Al-Anon?
No, I'm in AA.
Have you ever thought about being in Al-Anon?
Maybe.
I'm asking questions. I'm not giving suggestions,
Okay.
but it sounds like you need a little help in minding your own business.
No laughing. Okay, thank you, Herb.
I'm a very direct person, and
Okay.
so I hope I don't offend anybody. And if I do, it's not my intention. And if I misstep, I want you to bring it to my attention. But I like the word help.
Okay.
Through the lens of help. Now, I have a priority. I will help an alcoholic before I'll help anybody else. But if, in fact, I don't have an alcoholic in front of me, I'll help anybody in a 12-step program. If I don't have anybody in a 12-step program in the present moment, and somebody in my family or somebody at work or somebody in my neighborhood or somebody in the grocery store needs help, then I will help them.
I'm very curious to hear your interpretation when you turn your will and your life over to God, the care of God, not just God. And I love that you point out so much about the semantics. And I'm just wondering, what is your interpretation, the difference between turning over to God versus turning over to the care of God?
A great question. And where I came up with at least what I consider my clarity about it is I was listening to a long timer who's been dead for a couple decades, but one of the really revered long timers. And I was driving my car and he was talking about the third step. And he said, just turn your life and your will over to God, get out of the driver's seat, let God drive your life. I almost had an accident. I had to pull over to the side and catch my breath because I said, no goddamn way is that true. That's just horsepucky. It's my car. It's my responsibility. It's my life. I have free will. God doesn't want to drive my will. God gave me free will to use. Gave me intelligence to try to figure out what God's will is or reality. Gave me free will to make myself come to grips with reality and put myself in alignment. And that's my challenge as a human being. That's my spiritual development. But I'm not giving my life and my will to God to run. It's unhealthy psychology, let alone really terrible theology. So that's the difference that I came up with then, thinking about, so what is the language there? And the language in the book is that we turn our life and our will over to the care of God. That's where I developed the metaphor of the GPS. And today everybody can relate to that. I mean, I need to sit in the morning and get guidance. That's my GPS. But I need to use my mind. I've been given my mind to think, and I've been giving my will to make decisions based on that thinking. And when I'm out of alignment with reality, I will be disturbed. And my job then is to pay attention to being disturbed so that I can come back to realignment.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Isn't that just, I mean, it becomes so crystal clear that it's kind of like, especially with the GPS thing.
Well, that's really, that's a great metaphor because that really helps it just come to light in an understandable way.
And the word alignment's not in the big book, but it's my word to try to help get the whole sense of this going from being disturbed, going at cross purposes with reality, to being in alignment with reality. I'm in parallel. God is my director. I'm the actor. I will take directions, but it's my responsibility to find the directions and take directions. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
You said for me to find out the deeper level, what the source of the tension is within
All right.
me.
All right.
What do I do to find that source?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do step 4. or do a laser focus step 10.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but prayer and meditation and then discussion and maybe some journaling, some writing. I'm a big proponent when you get stuck is to do some stream of consciousness writing in after you pray the set aside prayer and see what happens with that question.
Thank you, Herb.
Well, let's close then with the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference.